Growing up, our house was like a military camp. My father, a college teacher, ran a tight ship. My older sister Sarah was the perfect child, obedient, studious, and always eager to please. Me? I was the wild card, the one who always pushed the boundaries. "Carol, sit up straight," my father would bark during dinner. "A lady doesn't slouch." I'd roll my eyes and straighten my spine, only to slump down again the moment he looked away. It was a constant battle of wills. My mother, though less vocal, was equally strict. She'd purse her lips disapprovingly at my choice of clothes or friends. "What will the neighbors think?" was her constant refrain. Despite the suffocating atmosphere at home, I managed to carve out a bit of freedom for myself. I started dating Jake when I was 16. He was 19, in college, and everything my parents would disapprove of. We kept it secret, stealing moments together whenever we could. Life seemed to be looking up. I had plans to go to college, to finally escape the suffocating grip of my parents' expectations. But fate, it seems, had other plans. It was a few months after my 18th birthday when I started feeling sick in the mornings. At first, I brushed it off as stress from my upcoming exams. But as the days went by, a nagging suspicion began to grow. I still remember standing in the tiny bathroom of a gas station, staring at the little plastic stick in my trembling hands. 2 pink lines. Positive. I was pregnant. I spent the next few days and a daze, trying to figure out what to do. I knew I had to tell Jake, but every time I picked up the phone, my courage failed me. Finally, I couldn't put it off any longer. We met at our usual spot, a small park hidden away from prying eyes. Jake was all smiles when he saw me, but his face fell as soon as he noticed my expression. "Carol, what's wrong?" he asked, reaching for my hand. I pulled away, wrapping my arms around myself. "I'm pregnant," I blurted out. The silence that followed was deafening. Jake's face went through a range of emotions: shock, disbelief, and then fear. "Are you sure?" he finally managed to say. I nodded, tears welling up in my eyes. I took 3 tests. They were all positive. Jake ran his hands through his hair, his eyes cold. "You need to get rid of it." "An abortion, Carol. It's the only way. We're too young for this. It would ruin both our lives." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This was Jake, the boy I thought I loved, telling me to abort our child like it was nothing more than an inconvenience. "Get out of my sight," I hissed, turning away from him. He left without another word, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the weight of the decision I now had to make. Telling my parents was even worse. I waited until after dinner, when my father was in his usual spot in the living room, reading the newspaper. My mother was knitting, and Sarah was there too, hovering in the background. "I have something to tell you," I said, my voice shaking. My father lowered his newspaper, eyeing me suspiciously. "What is it, Carol?" I took a deep breath. "I'm pregnant." The explosion that followed was worse than I could have imagined. My father's face turned an alarming shade of red as he yelled about shame and disappointment. My mother burst into tears, wailing about what the neighbors would think. Sarah just stood there, her face a mask of shock and disgust. "You will get an abortion," my father declared once he'd calmed down enough to speak coherently. "We'll find a discreet clinic. No one needs to know about this mistake." Despite my initial reluctance, the constant pressure from my family wore me down. A few days later, I found myself sitting in a sterile doctor's office, my mother and Sarah flanking me like prison guards. The doctor, a kind-faced woman in her 50s, reviewed my charts with a frown. She looked up at me, her eyes full of concern. "Carol, I need to inform you of something important," she said gently. "Given your medical history and certain risk factors, if you proceed with an abortion, there's a high likelihood that you may never be able to have children again." The words hit me like a ton of bricks. Never have children again? The choice suddenly became crystal clear. "No," I said, my voice stronger than I expected. "I'm not doing it. I'm keeping this baby." My mother gasped. Sarah rolled her eyes. But I stood firm. The drive home was tense and silent. As soon as we walked through the door, my father was there, expectant. Well, he demanded. She wouldn't do it, my mother spat. After everything we've done for her. My father's face contorted with rage. You ungrateful little, he cut himself off, taking a deep breath. When he spoke again, his voice was cold and final. Get out, he said. Pack your things and get out of this house. You're no daughter of mine. I won't have you embarrassing this family with your condition. My mother nodded in agreement, her eyes hard. You heard your father. Go. Sarah just stood there, silent and judgmental. Tears streaming down my face, I ran to my room and threw some clothes into a bag. As I headed for the door, my father's voice stopped me one last time. And don't think about coming back. As far as we're concerned, you're dead to us. The door slammed behind me, the sound final and devastating. I was alone, pregnant, and homeless. In desperation, I called the only person I thought might help, my Aunt Linda. She and Uncle Bob had always been the black sheep of the family, living in another state and rarely speaking to my parents. Carol? What's wrong, sweetie? Aunt Linda's voice was warm and concerned. Through tears, I explained everything. There was a long pause after I finished. Where are you now? She finally asked. Outside our house. They kicked me out. Another pause. Stay right there. We're coming to get you. The drive to Aunt Linda and Uncle Bob's house was long, but it gave me time to process everything that had happened. Their house was modest but welcoming. As soon as we arrived, Aunt Linda went into full mother hen mode, fussing over me and insisting I eat something. Uncle Bob carried my bag to the spare room, which would now be my room. It's not much, he said, setting the bag down, but it's yours for as long as you need it. I looked around the small, cozy room and felt a lump in my throat. It's perfect, I whispered. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of doctor's appointments, discussions about my future, and adjusting to my new life. We've been thinking, Aunt Linda said one evening over dinner. We want to help you continue your education. I looked up from my plate, surprised. What do you mean? Uncle Bob leaned forward. We've set aside some money over the years. We never had kids of our own, so we thought we'd use it to help you go to college. I was speechless. After everything that had happened, the idea of still being able to pursue my dreams seemed impossible. I don't know what to say. Say yes, Aunt Linda smiled. We believe in you, Carol. This baby doesn't have to mean the end of your dreams. And so, with their support, I enrolled in a local community college, majoring in business management. It wasn't easy, balancing classes with doctor's appointments and the increasing discomfort of pregnancy, but I was determined to make it work. I also found a job as a waitress at a local restaurant. The owner, a kind woman named Maria, was understanding about my situation and flexible with my hours. It wasn't much, but it allowed me to start saving for the baby and contribute a little to Aunt Linda and Uncle Bob's household. The day my son was born was the most terrifying and beautiful day of my life. After hours of labor, I held him in my arms, marveling at his tiny fingers and toes. Aunt Linda and Uncle Bob were there, beaming with pride like grandparents. What are you going to name him? Aunt Linda asked softly. I looked down at my son's face, so peaceful in sleep. Daniel, I said. It means God is my judge. Because no matter what anyone else thinks, I know I made the right choice. As I settled into motherhood, juggling a newborn with college classes and work, I often thought about my parents and Sarah. Had they heard about Daniel? Did they ever regret their decision? But I pushed those thoughts aside. I had a new family now, one that accepted me and loved me unconditionally. One day, as I was scrolling through social media during a rare moment of downtime, a post caught my eye. It was from Sarah. My heart skipped a beat as I read it. Excited to announce that Jake and I are engaged. Can't wait to start our life together. The photo showed Sarah, beaming, her arm around Jake, the same Jake who had abandoned me and our child. They looked happy, carefree. Like nothing had ever happened. I felt a surge of emotions, anger, hurt, betrayal. But as I looked over at Daniel, peacefully playing in his crib, I realized something. I didn't need their approval. I didn't need their love. I had everything I needed right here. The years flew by in a blur of diapers, textbooks, and late-night study sessions. My last semester was particularly challenging. I was taking extra classes to graduate on time, still working at the restaurant, and chasing after an energetic 3-year-old. Graduation day was a whirlwind of emotions. As I stood in line, waiting to receive my diploma, I scanned the crowd. Aunt Linda and Uncle Bob were there, of course, beaming with pride. Daniel sat on Uncle Bob's shoulders, waving excitedly every time he caught my eye. The real surprise came at the graduation party Aunt Linda and Uncle Bob threw for me. As we were celebrating, Maria, my boss from the restaurant, pulled me aside. "Carol, I have a proposition for you," she said, her eyes twinkling. "I'm looking for a new restaurant manager, and I think you'd be perfect for the job." I was stunned. "Me? But I've only ever been a waitress." Maria waved her hand dismissively. "You've been much more than that. I've seen how you handle difficult customers, how you organize the staff, how you balanced work and school and motherhood. That's the kind of dedication and skill I need in a manager." It was a dream come true. A stable job with better pay and regular hours, exactly what I needed for Daniel and me to start our new life. The next few years were a whirlwind of positive changes. I threw myself into my new role at the restaurant, learning everything I could about management and business operations. Daniel started school, growing into a bright, curious boy who loved to read and play baseball. It was at one of Daniel's Little League games that I met Tom. He was there with his son, Michael, who was on the opposing team. We struck up a conversation, and I was immediately drawn to his kind eyes and easy laugh. "Single dad?" I asked, noticing he was alone. He nodded, a sad smile crossing his face. "Widower, actually. Michael's mom passed away when he was a baby." My heart went out to him. "I'm so sorry. It must be tough." "It is," he admitted. "But we manage. How about you? Single mom?" I laughed. "Is it that obvious?" Our relationship developed slowly. We were both cautious, having been hurt before and with our children to consider. But as the months passed, I found myself falling for Tom. He was kind, patient, and Daniel adored him. A year after we met, Tom proposed. It wasn't a grand, theatrical gesture, just a quiet moment in his backyard, with our boys playing nearby. Our wedding was small and intimate, just close friends and family. As I walked down the aisle, Daniel proudly by my side as the ring bearer, I caught Aunt Linda's eye. She was crying, but her smile was radiant. Life with Tom, Daniel, and Michael settled into a comfortable rhythm. And a couple of years after our wedding, we were blessed with another addition to our family. Our daughter, Emily, was born on a warm spring morning. As I held her in my arms, with Tom, Daniel, and Michael gathered around the hospital bed, I felt a sense of completeness I'd never experienced before. I loved all 3 of my children equally, Daniel and Emily, my biological children, and Michael, my stepson. They were all my kids, regardless of blood ties. One evening, as Aunt Linda was over helping with the kids, we were startled by a familiar voice coming from the TV. There, larger than life, were my parents. My father was standing at a podium, waving to a cheering crowd. The ticker at the bottom of the screen read, "John Williams announces candidacy for mayor." I felt my heart stop. It had been years since I'd seen my parents, even if only on a screen. My father looked older, his hair grayer, but his eyes still held that stern, determined look I remembered so well. As we watched him speak about family values and moral integrity, Aunt Linda's face contorted with anger. "Hypocrites," she spat, her voice trembling with rage. I turned to her, shocked by her outburst. "Aunt Linda? She took a deep breath, her eyes never leaving the screen. "There's something you need to know, Carol. Something they've hidden for years." What she told me next shook me to my core. Many years ago, before Sarah and I were born, my parents had their first child, a boy. But he was born with severe physical defects, without legs. Instead of embracing their child, they left him at the hospital, afraid he would embarrass them. I felt a whirlwind of emotions: shock, anger, disbelief, and a profound sadness for the brother I never knew. "Why didn't you tell me before?" I asked. Aunt Linda's eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry, Carol. I should have. But after what they did to you, I didn't want to add to your pain." That night, after the kids were in bed, I made a decision. I needed to find my brother. With Tom's support, I hired a private investigator. Weeks passed, and finally, we got a lead. My brother was alive, and against all odds, he had thrived. He was a successful writer, married with children of his own. He had been adopted by a wealthy family who had given him every opportunity to succeed in life. Meeting him for the first time was surreal. Despite his physical differences, I could see echoes of my own features in his face. His name was James, and he greeted me with a warm smile and open arms. "I always knew I had a biological family out there somewhere," he said, his voice gentle. "I just never expected to find a sister." Over the next few months, James and I grew close. I introduced him to my family, and he welcomed us into his. His wife, Sarah, a coincidence that made me laugh, and their 2 children became a part of our extended family. 20 years had passed since that fateful day when my parents kicked me out of their house. Life had moved on, bringing its share of joys and sorrows. My eldest, Daniel, was now 19 and had just started college on a baseball scholarship. I couldn't have been prouder of the young man he'd become. One lazy Sunday afternoon, as I was scrolling through news articles on my tablet, a familiar face caught my eye. It was my father, looking older but still carrying that air of self-importance I remembered so well. The headline read, "Mayor John Williams discusses family values in exclusive interview." Curiosity got the better of me, and I clicked on the video. For a few minutes, I listened to my father espouse the importance of family, integrity, and moral values. And then, the interviewer asked about his children. My father's face softened into what I recognized as his public sympathy look. "I have one daughter, Sarah. She's the light of our lives. Tragically, we lost 2 of our children. The pain never really goes away, but it's made our family stronger." For days, I seethed with a quiet rage. How dare they? How dare they erase me, erase James, and paint themselves as tragic, sympathetic figures? Then, almost as if fate was intervening, James called. "Carol, guess what? I'm doing a book signing in our hometown next week. It would mean the world to me if you could come." "I wouldn't miss it for the world," I told James, a plan already forming in my mind. The following week, I found myself back in the city of my childhood. As I walked the familiar streets, memories flooded back, some good, many painful. I pushed them aside, focusing on what I needed to do. The book signing was being held in the grand ballroom of the city's most prestigious hotel. As I entered, I saw that James hadn't exaggerated, it seemed like half the town was there. Local celebrities, business leaders, and politicians all mingled, waiting for the event to begin. And there, in the front row, sat my parents and Sarah. My father, now the mayor, looked every inch the distinguished politician. My mother, elegantly dressed, smiled and nodded at acquaintances. Sarah was sitting next to them. They hadn't seen me yet. I took a seat near the back, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure everyone could hear it. James rolled onto the stage in a wheelchair, to enthusiastic applause. He looked confident, at ease in the spotlight. As he began to speak about his book and his life, I saw my parents nodding sympathetically. "I was born with a severe physical disability," James was saying. "No legs, and other health issues. My biological parents abandoned me at the hospital, unable or unwilling to care for a child with my needs. I watched my father's face carefully. He showed no sign of recognition, no hint of shame. Just the carefully crafted mask of a politician expressing appropriate concern for a constituent's sad story. James continued. I was fortunate. I was adopted by a wonderful family who gave me every opportunity to succeed. But I always wondered about my birth family. Who were they? Why did they give me up? The room was silent, all eyes fixed on James as he continued his story. I stood to the side, my heart racing, waiting for the moment that would change everything. Then, James smiled, his eyes twinkling with a mix of mischief and determination. But that's not the end of our story, he said. You see, I found my family. My sister, Carol, is here with us today. He turned towards me, extending his hand. Carol, would you join me on stage? A collective gasp rippled through the audience as I stepped into the spotlight. I saw recognition dawn on many faces. After all, I had grown up in this town. But the most striking reactions came from the front row. My parents' faces drained of color, their expressions a mixture of shock, fear, and dawning comprehension. Sarah, my sister, looked like she'd seen a ghost. They knew their carefully constructed facade was about to crumble. My parents stood abruptly, clearly intending to make a hasty exit. But I wasn't about to let them escape the truth again. Mom, Dad, please stay, I called out, my voice echoing through the now silent room. I think it's time we had an honest conversation, don't you? They froze, trapped by the eyes of the entire audience. Slowly, reluctantly, they sank back into their seats. I took a deep breath. Many of you knew me growing up. You knew my family. But there's a lot you didn't know. A lot that's been hidden for far too long. And then, I told them everything. How my parents had abandoned James at the hospital, ashamed of his physical differences. How they'd hidden his existence, building their reputation on a foundation of lies. And then, history repeated itself, I continued, my voice growing stronger. When I got pregnant at 18, they didn't offer support or understanding. They demanded I have an abortion, ignoring the doctors who said it could leave me infertile. And when I refused, they kicked me out. Their own daughter, pregnant and alone, thrown away to protect their precious reputation. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd. I saw looks of disgust directed at my parents, who seemed to shrink in their seats. For years, I've heard them talk about family values and morality, I said, my voice thick with emotion. But their actions tell a different story. They abandoned 2 of their children when we needed them most. They erased us from their lives to maintain their perfect image. The room erupted into chaos. People were shouting, some at my parents, others at each other. Journalists who had come to cover a simple book signing were now frantically taking notes or speaking rapidly into their phones. In the midst of the uproar, I locked eyes with my father. The man who had loomed so large in my childhood now looked small, defeated. My mother was openly weeping, while Sarah sat frozen, her face a mask of shock and confusion. In the days that followed, the story exploded. It was all over the local news, then national. My father's political career evaporated overnight. The man who had preached about integrity and family values was exposed as a hypocrite of the highest order. His position as mayor became untenable. He resigned within a week, citing personal reasons. But everyone knew the truth. The college where he had taught quickly distanced themselves, terminating his position. Amidst all the chaos, one thing became clear, my sister Sarah had made her choice. She stood firmly by our parents, refusing to acknowledge the truth of what they had done. You've ruined everything, she hissed during a brief phone call. Don't contact me again. You're dead to me, just like you're dead to Mom and Dad. But life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them. A few days later, I received a call from a number I hadn't seen in over 20 years. It was Jake, Sarah's husband, and the father of my eldest son. Carol? His voice was hesitant, almost sheepish. I've been thinking about us. About what happened. Sarah and we can't have children. And I thought, maybe we have a son together. We could be a family. I couldn't help but laugh. Jake, you made your choice 20 years ago. You abandoned me when I was pregnant with your child. You married my sister. And now, just because you can't have children with her, you think you can come back to me? No, that's not how this works. But Carol. No, Jake. I have a wonderful husband and a beautiful family. I don't need you, and I certainly don't want you. Goodbye. I hung up, feeling a sense of closure I hadn't realized I needed. However, the surprises weren't over. The next day, I received another unexpected call. This time, it was from Jake's parents. Carol, a tentative voice asked. This is Martha, Jake's mother. We just found out about Daniel. Is it true? Do we have a grandson? The conversation that followed was emotional and eye-opening. It turned out that Jake and my parents had told them I'd had an abortion and run away from home. They'd spent years believing their grandchild never existed. We'd like to meet him, Martha said, her voice trembling. If that's okay with you, of course. We understand if you don't want us in your lives. I thought about it for a moment. These people weren't responsible for Jake's actions or my parents' lies. They were victims of the deception too. Okay, I said finally. I'll talk to Daniel and see if he's open to meeting you. The meeting between Daniel and his paternal grandparents went surprisingly well. There were tears, hugs, and a lot of catching up to do. Daniel, always compassionate, welcomed them with open arms. In the months that followed, life settled into a new normal. James and his family became regular fixtures in our lives, filling our home with laughter and love. Aunt Linda and Uncle Bob doted on all the grandchildren, biological or not. As for my parents and Sarah, I heard snippets of news now and then. They'd moved away, trying to escape the scandal. Part of me felt sorry for them, but I knew I'd done the right thing in telling the truth.